Welcome to another episode of the Vikingology podcast. I'm co-host number one, CJ Adrian.
And I'm co host number two, Terry Barnes, and we are the art and science of the Viking Age.
And today
And
we have a minor celebrity in our field, major celebrity in our field, Dr. Jackson Crawford, whom you may have seen on YouTube. That's where I first encountered him. Formerly a teacher at the University of California, also at Berkeley, and then most recently at the University of Colorado. He is currently a public educator, mostly utilizing his platform on YouTube, which has over 250,000 subscribers at this point, I believe.
300,000 something, yeah.
300,000 something, which is pretty cool. And then some other accolades as you advised the video game Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I don't play video games, but I hear that that was a pretty important one. And then you also advised on the 2013 film Frozen.
Mhm.
And that's going to lead me into my first question because my
no.
first name is Christoph. And when that movie came out, I want to know, who do I need to talk to sue Disney over an infringement of using my image? The section in there that was the big tip off that somebody had used me specifically was in the sled when the girl falls off. And now I'm going off of memory, it's been a long time. When the girl falls off and she says, or no, Kristoff falls off the sled, and then she looks and goes, "Hey, Chris," and he goes, "Kristoff." That was my entire childhood in America, correcting people to not call me Chris. So, who did it? Was it you? Was it somebody else?
No, and I don't remember that scene either. I saw that movie once, because like the first weekend or week it was out, uh, I had, told my grandma that I've been working on this movie, and I said, "Oh, now it's in theaters." So I drove her down to, the Denver suburbs to see the movie at a mall. And all I remember is her just asking me like every minute, like, "Is that you? Is that you? Is that you?" It's like, no, it's I'm not like, I'm not in the movie. But by the time that I was consulting on it, they had already named everybody.
Mm.
Like I came in really, really late in the process. When I was working on this, it was early 2013, and the movie came out in, like November 2013. So
Yeah.
everybody was already named. I always thought the names were like, hopefully I'm not going to see that patented Disney like targeting laser start crawling up my shirt here. But because they are terrifying, their lawyers are terrifying people. So I don't know if it's speaking out of turn exactly, but like I never quite understood the principle behind the names because you know, just there didn't seem to be a system behind it. And Christoph is like culturally, his clothing and the reindeer association and stuff like that, he seems to be implicitly sort of Sami,
Mhm.
where
Mm.
Christoph as a name doesn't suggest that. So I don't know. Yeah, I
I
really actually don't know what went into the names.
I have a picture of myself with a pack of gum that has the character Kristoff on there and held it side by side on my profile. It's a home ringer. Somebody owes me royalties.
I wouldn't know. I back when I was still on Facebook, I was Facebook friends with one of the directors, which was a pretty weird experience because, like for the most part, it's just the same stuff people put on Facebook anywhere. But then occasionally you get like behind the scenes at the Oscars. It's like, oh, wow, that's something to see. Um, I Names are such an interesting thing because to me, they can really add or subtract from authenticity. Um, that was one of the things that I actually was privileged to have something to do with Assassin's Creed Valhalla was like trying to have some kind of consistent system to the names, and make them a little more authentic seeming. The hardest thing there, I don't play video games either, so I've actually never seen the completed game, but the main character that you play is named Eivor. And the reason for that was that they wanted a name that was as close as possible to gender neutral because they wanted to be able to record dialogue characters talking to this person, whether it was a man or a woman, and not have to change anything about it.
Mm.
Um, but there really is no such thing as gender neutral in Old Norse because all names are pretty explicitly marked. So I suggested this name or a name like it. There were a few in a list because all you had to do was change like one vowel, like because Avar would be the masculine, Eivor feminine. So it seemed to them uh, less marked than something where you had to change, multiple syllables. Uh, yeah, but names are a big feature of, I think, making anything seem sort of real. Of course, if you really wanted something to seem real, you would have 5 or 6 characters who were all named Thorstein, right?
Right.
Yeah. Or Harold with an A.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you read the Icelandic saga, it's like everybody's Thorstein.
Yeah.
It's like,
Hmm.
down to the point where it'll be like Thorstein the Black, Thorstein the Red, Thorstein, it's
Hmm.
like we actually have to sort of really split hairs about which one.
Or I have a question before we get into the Viking Age stuff. Um, because my beloved Seahawks won the Super Bowl on Sunday.
Yeah.
And it very well, other than Mr. Nix's ankle, might well have been a Denver Broncos matchup. Are you a fan? I think I saw you. Did you post something on Instagram about like the helmet that you wanted for every Christmas when you were a kid?
Yeah, the helmet that I was supposed to have won. I've never been a big sports guy. I mean, if I'm a Broncos fan, it's by default, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I do have a Seahawks related memory because when I was at UCLA in 2014, you may remember that your boys absolutely stomped mine. But the guy in the office next to me was from Seattle. So we said, oh, we should watch the Super Bowl together. Right. So like just sitting there like, oh, they're, every quarter, like they're gonna pull this out. They're gonna put in like in every quarter, like you believe it a little bit less. It's like, oh boy, all right, yeah, you're gonna this is fun. Quotation mark.
Oh.
Oh well.
Oh well. Well, I have like just a basic question, since you are a specialist in Old Norse, um, and some of our listeners and watchers, whatever, will probably know this, or maybe venture a guess. But what's the word Vikingur mean in Old Norse? What does it mean to be a Viking in Old Norse?
Right in the
Yeah,
deep end, Terry.
What?
Right in
What?
the deep end, Terry.
well, it's kind of deep in and it's kind of not. I mean, it's not the hardest word in the world to get to the semantics of. Um, so you have semi-famously there's 2 nouns here. There's a feminine noun Viking and there's a masculine noun Vikingur. So a person is a Vikingur and a Vikingur goes out on a Viking. So a Viking is a raid, typically seaborne raid. It doesn't seem to come up in terms of, like you don't go on a Viking against a land neighbor, but against perhaps a sea neighbor or across a seaway. So a Vikinger is someone who engages in seaborne piracy, essentially. It's not a compliment in Old Norse. So you don't see people calling, you wouldn't call someone on your own team, as it were, a Viking, even if someone that didn't like you might call you a Viking. You probably wouldn't call yourself that. Um, on Viking Age runestones, we don't see it used positively. It's not like he was a good Viking. It's, he was a good Drengr, right? The compliment word. Or he was a good felagi, fellow, companion, something like that. The same word exists in Old English and Old Frisian. Old English, Weeching, probably. The Old Frisian is like Weeching. Uh, but they apply it to Scandinavian pirates, right? It's not a positive term. Where it comes from is a little bit unclear. Some people think that it's related to Vik, which is the bay, right? Oslo is in a Vik. There's Reykjavik, right? Vik is common in Scandinavian place names. Another possibility that I think is really interesting and I think an attractive possibility is that it's related to Vikya, which is to change, to move. And when you change shifts at the oars, you Vikya, who's who's taking turns. So that it's somebody who takes a turn rowing. right? So that originally it basically is like member of a ship's crew. Like to me, that's a pretty attractive etymology for the term, but we'll probably never know exactly what it comes from. What I think is most surprising in regards to it is that it's not really ever their term for themselves, but it's a term that we like, it's never going to stop being applied to them now, right?
Yeah.
It's so associated with them in popular terminology and in specialist terminology because, people talk about the Viking Age and specialists all know what you're talking about when you say that, right? Something roughly 800 to 1100 in Scandinavia. There is a certain cultural and linguistic and archaeological coherence to the term. So I don't think it's ever going to be replaced.
Yeah, sort of Alex Wolf had written that article, what, back I think in 2022 or something, about, time to get rid of the word Viking. And his main thing, I think, was just because of the conflation of it with, ethnicity, which, comes later,
It is.
obviously, but, it's kind of like, I felt the same way when I read it. It's like, yeah, I think the horse is out of the barn on this one, it's kind of a bit,
Oh yeah.
you can't, yeah.
No, the horse is totally out of the barn. I don't try to, I don't know, reject or rehabilitate it. I mostly just don't use it very much because like maybe if I use the word Viking a little bit more often in video titles or something, that might be worth like a few more clicks. But my impression, again, as we were saying earlier, is I don't know if I really believe in the algorithm and that there's some magical way to make more people click. And so I mostly don't use the word unless I think that it's particularly appropriate. Mostly when I use it, I'll use it in the phrase Viking Age. Uh, but maybe I should use it more.
Yeah, I got into an interesting discussion just last week. And CGI emailed that to you, but I didn't hear back from you, so I don't know if you saw it because you were, busy in Oregon and stuff. But we have a subscriber who had reached out, shout out Guff, who wrote a pretty nice piece. But, and I don't know, he's not affiliated with, a university or anything. He's just, an interested person. I think, I don't know, independent scholar or whatever, but he studies Old Norse. And so he wrote a piece that was about the etymology of the word, the morphology, the lexicology, all whatever of, like you said, this is the masculine and the feminine version. What does it mean? And he talked about the Veek thing. And then, he asked me like, take a look at this and I'd be interested in what you think. And so I did. And then, we went back and forth for several times, sort of discussing some of these ideas because he was very keen on being very specific about the language. And it's like they don't really have a word for this or that. And one of them was pirate, because I was like, and I sent him like a couple of articles that Neil Price has done where he's done some, connecting between, what the quote unquote Vikings were doing with what looks like piracy even later, in kind of the golden age of piracy, right? And stuff. And he's like, yeah, he didn't buy it. It was like, I don't think, because they don't have a word for pirate. And then we also had sort of a discussion about, was it a job? What kind of activity is it? Because there's a lot of people too who make the distinction of like, okay, to be a Viking is not an ethnicity, but it's also not a job either. And then there's other people, and I'm included in that. I'm like, oh, yeah, it kind of was for some of them, I mean, or activity, however you want to split hairs on those words. But so then we were sort of going down the rabbit hole of, is there Old Norse for like occupation or job? And then I was trying to express sort of my interest as a historian in like, I want to know, okay, A, if there was a word or not, but that B, how would they consider that word? Because maybe we think of the word, maybe occupation in a particular way, but would they have seen it in the same way that we see it now? Anyways, it was just like, yeah, the etymology of all of this to try to say, okay, A, were there pirates? There was also like, he's like, violence is not a thing either. And so then we were going down the rabbit hole of various Old Norse words for violence. And so anyway, because that's something I'm interested in of like, okay, we always talk about the Viking Age as a violent place. For us, that's probably true. And most of us probably wouldn't last a day if we went back there. But did they see themselves as violent? And did they understand what that meant in the same kind of way? So yeah, I don't know. Like, what are your thoughts about like some of these connections with these words and whether or not they actually had words for these things?
Well, there's a lot there. I think there's definitely words for violence. I don't think there's any question that words like strid and vig are essentially translatable as violence or violent incident. I think there's a word for pirate. I think Vikinger could be fairly translated as pirate. So could Ranningi, robber, especially in a compound like Sio Ranningi, which occurs sea robber. Um, the occupation thing is an interesting question because, of course, no one's issuing them W-2s, um, right? I mean, like for the most part, I think that your self-conception might be less linked to occupational questions than our self-conception, right? Because somebody asks you pretty quickly after they meet you in our society, what do you do, right? I think that those questions are a little bit less pertinent to identity at a time like this because what you do is so necessitated as opposed to optional. Like what do you do for most people? The answer to that most of the year is, well, duh, I do whatever. And that's determined by the time of year, right? What I'm doing with my crops or whatever. And I think that for some people, probably the occupation of Viking is part of that sort of seasonally necessitated or seasonally governed aspect of what they're doing, right? It's summer. Let's go, raid in England or Frisia or France or something before the harvest. We've got some spare manpower and a ship. Like it's just one of the ways that you kind of diversify and increase your income. Also a term that's not quite applicable, but um, so I think that yeah, it's just socially a different question for them. They do have occupations, but those occupations tend to be people that are not on the margins, but people that have very, very specialized skills that other people don't necessarily have and that take a long time to learn. I think of like a smith, um, a jeweler, people like that probably have occupations that they're doing all year that are different from what other people are doing. But I think for the most part, someone engaged in violence is essentially a season, to use a weird term, a seasonal violence worker, right? It's like that's just the thing that's profitable this time of year. Um, like you're looking at your mental balance sheet and saying like, well, I could scratch at the soil in June, or I could go raid a monastery in England. Like, obviously, if I have the means to do that, that's going to get me more than scratching at the soil for another month. Does that make sense as a position?
Yeah, yeah. That brings up something. I'm actually in the throes of editing another book, and it's historical fiction, and it's Viking Age stuff. And there's a scene that I was going over earlier where one of the characters brings up the word job. And I guess the first time that I went through, I thought that was perfectly okay. But actually, I paused on that today, thinking about it. Like, did they have jobs? Because this is a
Yeah,
subsistence economy. They're just trying to not starve to death,
Yeah.
right?
yeah,
So it's much. So it's like it's so is it. So I resonate with your point of saying that the whole concept of occupation is kind of tricky, unless we're talking about something really specific. So this idea that a Viking, like you hear this online all the time, like Viking's an action word. And it's like, well, actually, you brought up a really good point. It was used as a noun and a verb, so that's not entirely, right to say that it's just an action word, but also to say it describes an occupation doesn't seem to quite fit either, given the construction of the society that we are talking about, right? Am I on the right track
yeah,
there?
yeah. Because again, there's no W-2 that
Right.
says, this is your salary for doing Viking stuff. Um, if you read the sagas, and of course, usual disclaimer, I'm a linguist. The language and the text in it are my main access to this culture. But if you read the sagas, the people who are doing what we would consider Viking stuff are not doing it all year, right? Egil Skallagrimsson is not spending all year raiding in Latvia. That's something that he finds himself doing for part of a season, right? And then, other times of the same year, he's hanging out at court with the Norwegian king making poems for him, or he's back home in Iceland tending to his farm. Like people are just doing whatever they need to do to maximize their profit again, right? Like, and that can be like, hey, we have the opportunity and the manpower to go raid, or that can also be like, hey, let's keep the farm going at home and make sure that we've got the wool to trade and the milk products and the sheep products. There you go. There's that word.
Cheap.
To get us through the winter, like I just aside from a few cases, again, like blacksmiths come to mind, jewelers come to mind, people with really, really specialized skills that take a long time to learn. I don't think that most people are defining themselves by the question of what do you do. They're much more defining themselves by questions of class, right? Are you high class or low class? Um, which is almost a question of like, do you get to decide what you do or not? Um, I think they're defining themselves often by questions of family loyalty, but not very often by questions of, what do you do? Because what do you do is so necessitated by season. Uh, it's actually perhaps not that different from, a self-employed weirdo like myself today. Like, what do I do? Like, well, I make YouTube videos, but like if people completely stopped watching those videos, or if no one was, donating on Patreon to support making those videos, like I would pretty quickly pivot to doing something else, right? Like it's not like it's the only thing that I could possibly do, um, because I would go bag groceries or something, right? Like, and I'm not locked into it in the same way that I feel like they're not locked into forever. Just, I don't know, bashing people on the head with an axe and taking their stuff. That's just one of many ways to make ends meet.
Yeah, I wonder about that, just not conceiving of it as a job or an occupation, but actually conceiving of it as an identity. I wonder if, some of those guys who become kind of, part of the warrior elite, I can imagine that kind of, for themselves defines who they are, and they think it's pretty badass, to be that guy. So the distinction between a job and an identity, I think,
At an elite level, I think that there's something to be said for violent occupations being part of their identity. But then what's distinguishing you, what you're bragging about, isn't that you're a Vikinger, it's that you're, a Hirðmaður,
yeah.
right? The king appointed me to be part of his Hirð, right? I'm part of the elite bodyguard of the king, whether I'm with him all the time or not. I've been admitted to this circle. Like that's definitely part of, an identity. That's something you lead with in introducing yourself. If you're just somebody who's gone off in the summer occasionally, again, to bash someone on the head with an axe and take their stuff, I don't know if that's part of your identity because it's kind of like what, well, every dude does for a period of a few centuries during the summers if they have the means.
Yeah.
Like it
But
just doesn't seem, I guess, like just to put it another way, it doesn't seem as much more relevant to someone's identity as than if I say, I bagged groceries every summer in high school. Like that's way down the list of things that I would introduce myself to you by saying, right? Because like who didn't, right? Like it's not an unusual thing to do. And I feel like that's kind of probably where this would be for men of a certain class in a certain area for a few centuries.
Yeah.
it seems to me, based on everything you just said and what you bring up, Terry, I can't remember if it's Neil Price or Anders Winroth that talks about the word Viking potentially being a loan word from Frisian. And you brought this up earlier. I remember it as being Wiesengas, but if it's we like to label things, and I think that's a human tendency. And to me, it seems like it's so complicated to try and pin down. Well, was it used for identity or whatever? How was it used in the Norse world? And I think the evidence shows that probably it wasn't used all that much. And so could it have just been an identity that was given to them by their victims that then came into the Norse language just kind of as almost a curiosity, right? Like, oh, they call us, And so then when they're going around and talking to, for example, well, we don't have evidence of this, but if they're going around and talking to people in the Frankish Empire or in England, and then they're like, "Who are you?" "Oh, we're Vikings." Maybe they thought it was a convenient moniker for them to use to explain who they were and what they were there to do, just like we use it as a convenient moniker to describe them, but it's not something that came from them.
I don't think it's a loan word. If that's it, I don't think Vinrud is the one who argued that. I could be wrong, but I know him pretty well, and I don't remember him ever saying anything like that. But I could be wrong. I don't think it's a loan word. I think it's a cognate, but I also don't think that they're using it. I just don't think that it's used first person. I just don't think you tell people that you're a Viking. I think that we remember them that way because our access to them is largely through English speaking sources. And in English speaking sources, that's what they're called. But they will call somebody rating them, because that happened too, a Viking, right? So I think it's effectively pirate. And we, in retrospect, call them pirates because that's what the people speaking the earlier stage of our language called them. But what are they calling themselves? Probably like we're Danes, right? Or we're Swedes, or we're, probably somewhat finer grain than we would use today. We're Jottar, or we're men from Sogn or whatever. Like, I think that's probably actually what you're leading with when you're, I don't know, making a treaty with the English or something, right? I don't think they're saying like we're Vikings. It's not borne out by what they call themselves in runic inscriptions. It's not borne out by Viking Age poetry, where that's not a term that you use positively of somebody, even if it's someone that we would call Viking, right? That they're being called Drengur or Felgi or Thegn. Judith Jesh has that great book, Ships and Men of the Late Viking Age, that really gets into the vocabulary that they are using for themselves. And Vikings really,
Yeah.
to my recollection, not a positive term they are using of themselves.
Yeah, that's actually some of, I sent a couple of chapters of that, or maybe at least one anyway, to this subscriber. I'm like, take a look at Yesh's work on this because it's pretty important, which he was familiar with. But when I looked at what he was citing, it was sort of earlier in the book, and I'm like, yeah, here, take a look at chapter 6. It's a little bit. But I think from talking to her, and then also Rainer, who in Iceland. Rainer is a good friend of ours, and he knows a fair amount about the sagas. And so he was the one who described. We co-wrote something last year, and in the process of that, we were kind of talking about this. And then he was the one who described to me sort of the in-group versus out-group kind of dynamic that Jesh also talks about too, where it's like if you call somebody a Viking, or like Viking. To do the Viking thing to other people is fine. To do the Viking in your in-group, bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Rainier is, man, that is a memorable person, no matter how many times you encounter him. I like Rainier a lot.
Rainer just told me last week that I needed to ask you about an incident in a natural pool in the west of Iceland last year when you were there.
And
I mean, maybe was it? Oh no, wait, that was the year before last, was it? I don't know when you did, because I know you were there for the burning of the house thing. We did an episode
yeah,
with them about
an
that.
incident? I don't remember an incident,
Oh, well, he
but
does. I
like,
don't know. He didn't describe what it was. That's as far as he said.
yeah, well, he has interesting narrative capabilities. He can turn anything into a story. So um, I mean, uh, but I mean, he'd give you the shirt off his back
Yes, he
and
does.
then stay shirtless the rest of the day. That's Rainier,
Yeah.
actually, in
Yeah.
a nutshell. Yeah.
He saves puffins. He does the annual puffin save.
Uh-huh. And he
He's
has
very proud of that.
his little poofy white dog that he likes to send videos of.
Snoother.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, when he came to see me last August when I was there, he brought Snoother, and then Snoother proceeded to pee all over his shirt.
That's, I mean, what higher benediction than that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Rainier is a character. There's people that's like you'll just always remember meeting, and Rainier is one of those.
Yes. Yes, he is. So, but there's the distinction, right? Of sort of like Viking for the outsider
Yeah, yeah.
community is, yeah.
But
Okay, you can
it's
go raid those people, but don't like, well, that old military phrase, don't shit in your mess kit. Like, don't do that to your own people, your own in group, right?
yeah, absolutely. It's the psychology of a wolf pack, right? I mean, like what wolves will do to elk is very different from what wolves will do to other wolves. And there is fighting among wolves, but it looks very different from the lethal, um, you know, cut and take tactics that they use against elk, right? So are we talking about other wolves? Or are we talking about elk? Or sometimes, maybe we are kind of in the psychology of the elk, and then we talk about wolves, but then we're using the term negatively, right? So it's all about just the psychology of how you approach the people who are doing the violence.
So when you say a Viking is a pirate, what in your mind does it mean to be a pirate? What does a pirate do?
A sea-based robber, right? I someone who takes things by force and does so by means of nautical transportation, right? I'm not a pirate if I hit you over the head in an alley. I'm just a robber. But if I hit you over the head on a seashore and I sail away, I am a pirate, is how I would take that.
CJ, why are you laughing?
I got a kick out of that definition. I think that's very good. Yeah, they're vandals on ships.
Yeah, right. I mean, I don't think that's particularly far from a common definition of pirate. Uh, it is a word that evokes two things, right? It is robbery plus boat to put a word cloud up. Mhm.
Does it include
So
the Psychoninger? Like not only just the stealing, but also like sort of the active control of access to waterways or not, sort of,
I don't feel like control of waterways is a necessary part of that semantic cloud, but it could coincide with it. I think you could be a state-sponsored Viking, right? I don't think that it necessarily has to be a stateless robber, right? Because privateers, I think, still count as pirates.
yeah.
Would
I
uh
think.
would extracting Danegeld count under this definition?
See, I wouldn't necessarily call that being a Viking. I would just call that intimidation, right?
Extortion.
Yeah, because they do the exact same thing to the Sami,
Hmm.
right? And I mean, that's not ever called being a Viking or going on Viking. Right, they often these northern Norwegian jarls are taking the tribute from the Sami and marten skins and things like that. They don't ever call that being a Viking. They just call it taking the tax, right? So I don't think that falls into the definition.
Protection racket, like the mafia. Could we call it a
Yeah, and I,
mafia?
and I mean that's far from some kind of Scandinavian specialty, right? I mean everybody
Right.
did that,
Hmm.
Yeah.
right? That's almost the foundation of feudalism, right? It's
Right.
just like, are the people, is their medieval zip code the same as yours or not? Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and they played no small part in the creation of that system, right? As well.
as far
What do
as
you
I
mean?
know,
Hmm.
although that's a little outside my domain, I don't know a whole lot about feudal Europe. That's not really where our texts come from in Old Norse studies anyway. And I
Well,
don't
then
know that like
go ahead, finish.
I was just going to say, like Iceland doesn't really have like a feudal stage. So
Mhm.
Yeah.
most of my access to feudalism just comes from Icelandic translations of, King Arthur sagas and things like that. I'm not necessarily a. Uh, this is one of the reasons why I don't often use the term medievalist, because even though by some definitions I am, um, I think that medievalist invokes a little bit more of a broad, broad-based uh, medieval historian, which I'm not, right? Like I can't tell you a whole, I don't have any special knowledge of medieval England or France or Germany or something like that. But,
Well, I do have a question for you on, by the way, I was going to make a really bad joke by mispronouncing feudal and saying, well, then it's a feudal conversation. But anyway,
there
it was
you
bad. It was
go. Yeah.
terrible. No one laugh. No one. And anyway, I do have a question about place names. And this is something that you probably will be able to answer. So one of the confusing things about studying the Brittany region during the so-called Viking Age, especially from the quote unquote Viking point of view, is tracking down place names. And there is a word in Old Norse, Bretland, which from our perspective, modern speakers of English, French, etc., would say, hey, that must be Brittany, but it appears to be confused with Wales and potentially Cornwall. Do you have any insider knowledge since you've translated a lot of these sagas that, especially I think it's mentioned in Icelandic sagas over kind of the how they were putting together place names for far-flung places and then maybe speak to a little bit of that confusion sometimes that arises from them themselves not being super clear on what it's associated with?
Well, Bretlon, my initial reading of that would be Wales. That it would be Britain, but not England
Hmm.
and not Scotland, I suppose. So yeah, pretty much I would say that comes down to Wales. I wouldn't be shocked if it were applied to Brittany, although I can't recall an instance where I know it was. You could look through the O and P and see if there are occurrences that definitely apply to Brittany. I don't know if they're super, super fine-grained aware of all the ethnic differences in medieval Britain. I mean, we're not, right? I mean, people get so confused about, who was speaking what, where in Britain over the last couple thousand years. And it's not even the most complicated story in the world, right? But like people get really confused about it and picture like Stonehenge and associate it with Celts, which doesn't have anything to do with Celts, but there's multiple different groups of Celts. I think they're also kind of confused about this stuff. Um, they definitely use England in about the same sense as we do. Um, the island itself, I don't know that I have seen an Old Norse text that refers to the island of Great Britain because it always seems like they're talking about a particular area, right? England or Scotland or Wales. Um, but yeah, their awareness of ethnic differences outside of their own is not super. Um, they're a little maybe more tuned into the English and the differences between English kingdoms, but then they can understand the English kind of okay. Um, Occasionally in the Icelandic sagas, there seems to be some kind of, reasonable awareness of differences in Ireland between different Irish kingdoms. But some of that may be made up because a lot of these guys are, they're half Irish or a quarter Irish themselves, and they're trying to kind of like boost their claim that their mom was a Irish princess or whatever. So it's hard to know how much of that is legit and how much isn't. Although sometimes their memories of Irish history seem to be pretty good. Um, I wouldn't say that there seems to be a lot of really great awareness of what Welsh means. It's also maybe an interesting note etymologically that English uses the term Welsh, which goes back to a word borrowed into Proto-Germanic from Proto-Celtic from the name of a Celtic tribe, Wolcas. And this word becomes just a Germanic word for foreigner. So to the English, the prototypical foreigners are the Welsh, and so the term comes to be applied to them. For the Norse, this prototypical foreigner is a Frenchman. So Valland, and that Val is exactly cognate with the wall in Wales, is France rather than Wales. Uh,
Interesting. Huh. So anything foreign is just vol, you know, something.
originally it is foreign, and then yeah, it comes to be specialized to Welsh and English, but then French and Norse. Um, it's just whoever the prototypical sort of foreigner is. Yeah.
Interesting. You mentioned something that I want to pick up on because this is something that we've talked about in previous episodes, specifically with Northern England. Like we've talked to Tom Horn, Claire Downham about Norse becoming a lingua franca in the British Isles during this time. You mentioned that Anglo-Saxon is pretty close, and I read a paper years ago about a genetic study that was done. They're looking for Vikings, right? They found nothing, and then there was a paper that came out after saying, well, maybe it's because they're so genetically close that we just can't tell them apart yet with the genomic tools that we had at the time. This is over 10 years, 15 years ago. But as far as languages are concerned, I have heard it said that the Anglo-Saxon languages and Norse languages are pretty close, but I don't have a good sense of just how close they were. And you mentioned that they could probably understand each other. Could you speak to maybe just the similarities between the two and maybe just how close they were?
Yeah, the Germanic languages at this time, none of them have had enough time to diverge to the point that you wouldn't be able to tell really fast that they were related. Like today, uh, if you walk around in Germany, if you walk around in Stockholm and you hear the local language spoken, you're not going to like immediately intuit like, oh, English is actually really close to this. This is going to be a situation more like it's not going to my impression is it's not going to immediately be understandable to you, but you're going to hear a lot that is, and you're going to realize that it's not going to be that big of a lift to make the right substitutions to make yourself understandable. It would be more of a situation of, say, a Spanish speaker encountering Portuguese, having never heard Portuguese before, or a Swedish speaker who's never heard Danish somehow encountering Danish for the first time. And at first you're kind of like, what? Right? Like, but then it's like, oh, okay. Like when I say make this vowel, you make that vowel. Like you kind of eventually figure out the substitutions. So I don't think an Old English speaker and an Old Norse speaker just meeting and shouting at each other are necessarily going to understand each other. They spend a little bit of time in close proximity. Yeah, they're not going to have a real hard time figuring out how to make the right substitutions. Simon Roper and I did a little experiment, which is actually still the biggest viewed video on my channel about 5 years ago, where we acted like we were an Old English speaking and an Old Norse speaking hunter encountering each other in Northern England during the Viking Age and just seeing if we could understand each other. Works pretty well. Uh, like again, you just have to kind of figure out what substitutions to make, right? You make this vowel, I make that vowel. The languages are still real close, and the Norse are aware of this. So in the saga of Gunnlaug Wormtongue, somewhat famously, there's a part where Gunnlaug goes to the court of the English king and becomes one of his poets, and we get this little explainer that says like, well, now the language in England and Scandinavia is somewhat different to the writer in the 1200s, but at the time, the languages were still like much the same or something like that, which is pretty correct. And the first grammatical treatise written in the 1100s in Iceland, so actually, somewhat after the Viking Age, the the author says we should write like the English do because it is clear that both of our languages are from a common source, even though both have changed a little bit or one has changed quite a bit. So they're very aware these languages are related. Um, and if you look at, Beowulf, um, it is not that hard, I can tell you from experience, to teach someone who reads Old Norse or even modern Icelandic to like pick up on the things that are a little bit different with Old English and start reading it. Uh, in fact, I don't really know anybody who's into Old English who doesn't do some Old Norse or vice versa because there's enough transferability of skill. One of the reasons that I don't talk about Old English as much as I could on the channel is just that there's this weird territorial thing where Old English people sort of don't like Old Norse people muscling in on their territory.
Oh,
But
academia.
yeah,
That sounds awfully or suspiciously similar to what was happening during the Viking Age. Hey,
yeah,
what are you doing here? We're here to take your stuff.
yeah, maybe. Um,
Yeah.
but I've been talking more about other old Germanic languages than I used to, just because people ask me about this kind of thing. Um, but I tend to be most reluctant with Old English just because it's like, I feel like Old English people feel like this is, theirs in a way. But there's a lot of really good Old English YouTubers too, right? I mean, Simon Roper has been on for a long time. Graham Shepard recently has been doing a lot of good Old English content. So,
Yeah, I think with Claire, what she was talking about, maybe even because she specializes in the Vikings in Ireland, and I think it was more of like, okay, you get what is it like? I don't know, is Creole the right word? But yeah, like you get this kind of strange sort of dialect, maybe that's of its own, but particularly like maybe in Dublin, right? So where business is conducted, that it's just sort of this interesting kind of liminal zone where she argues that probably Old Norse would have been kind of the default language.
I was about to say it's definitely the Celts learning to speak Norse and not the other way around. They are not learning Celtic languages. That is like you only have to look at one page of an old Irish grammar to see it is easier for an Irishman to learn to speak Norse than vice versa. Um, yeah, it's really striking that in fact, in terms of borrowing from Celtic, even in a place like Iceland, where they're in very close contact with a large population of Celtic speaking slaves, they don't borrow a lot of vocabulary. They borrow some names, but they're not borrowing lots of, you know, everyday vocabulary. They borrow a fair amount from Old English though, and from Frisian,
Yeah.
Hmm.
languages where they that are fairly easy for them to pick up and vice versa. It is not easy to pick up a Celtic language if you don't already speak one. Uh,
Is
so
that
yeah,
is that something that's been looked at? I'm just thinking along the lines of I just wrapped up a course on early medieval Brittany, and I brought up the cat study, where some researchers looked at cat DNA around Europe and found trace evidence of Norwegian cats that had really gotten around all over the place, and is
huh,
evidence of where the Vikings had gone. And then one of my students sent me an article about mice in the Azores Islands, and so
not sure.
and apparently the mice are like really territorial, and so the first mice to get there are the mice that stay, presumably. And these mice that are in the Azores are all of Scandinavian provenance, which is proof that the Vikings went there first and not the Portuguese, which is kind of cool. So
Oh,
it's these fun little things that people are finding. And
I
I'm
wouldn't
just
have ever
wondering,
guessed that.
I'm wondering if linguistically that's something that's been looked at in the Old Norse language itself, is these loan words. So you just mentioned that they weren't picking up loan words, very much, but eh, can we dissect a little bit where Viking Age Scandinavians went based on loan words? Are there any
Yeah, a
wild
little.
ones from like really far away? Like I want to say like Baghdad.
I cannot think off the top of my head of loanwords from Arabic. So I mentioned way earlier, maybe 20 minutes ago, that there are loans from Proto-Celtic into Proto-Germanic. So way before Norse and English and German and Gothic were differentiated, right? Back when they're all one language being spoken in Northern Europe, Proto-Germanic, and back before the Celtic languages were differentiated. They're close enough still that there is some back and forth, and there is a lot of borrowing into the ancestry of English and Norse from Proto-Celtic. So lots of words, iron, this word for foreigners, wagon, um, potentially, well, yeah, wagon definitely. Rune, I think, is probably a borrowing from Celtic in this period. But during the Viking Age, these languages are so different now that there's not the same potential for back and forth. But during the Viking Age, there's borrowings from Old English, Old Frisian. Weirdly enough, the word for boat is borrowed from English or Frisian. It's actually not it's not the word you would expect in Old Norse, which is odd that they would borrow a word for boat when the thing that we really know them for is seafaring. Um, there's a few borrowings from Slavic. So actually a word for interpreter, which kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Those are people you would need an interpreter with. A few other things from Slavic. Uh, and then you get English borrowings, and they tend to be either kind of high culture things, gemstones, right? Like stuff that they might be sort of learning about from the English. We're a little bit more connected to richer parts of Europe. Uh, but then especially the vocabulary for Christianity largely comes from English. So when they're converted, you can see that it's largely they're being converted by Englishmen because that vocabulary is very, very English. Um, so that's a domain where you definitely see it. They are willing to borrow words. They don't have some kind of ideological commitment against it. Um, but in the Middle Ages, they're an independent people. There's not a lot of new technology spreading around. There's just not as much room to borrow stuff as there is today, where you have constant new technological items that need names. And now today, modern Icelandic is very resistant to loan words, or has been up to maybe the current generation, but they don't seem to have that kind of ideological opposition to it.
When does
Um,
the split start to happen as far as so you're like going from Proto-Norse, Old Norse, and then you're like West and East Old Norse, and then kind of getting into the sort of more of the modern forms? Is it like in maybe the early modern period, or I don't know if it's late medieval or whatever? I mean, I've found because the only foreign language I've ever studied was German, which I did for like 2 years in college and all 4 years of high school. And so I have a good sense of, the grammar of that and, some of the vocabulary or whatever that I can pick up. And so I've spent a lot of time in Iceland, and I've found that has been like super helpful to, people say, oh, Icelandic is so difficult. And it's like, I don't know, if you know German, you can see it. But when I went to Denmark, it was like, whoa, clearly to me anyway, a mashup of Norse, German, and English. And I'd be like, okay, if I lived in Denmark, I feel like I could be fluent in like a month because of the way it's just that much little different over there compared to what Iceland is right now. So where does that, split really start to happen?
well, it's very easy for Scandinavians to learn English, and it's very easy for English speakers to learn Scandinavian. We just don't know that because nobody tries.
Yeah.
But yeah, right. The languages are close, and part of that is that part of the reason Danish or Norwegian or Swedish is easier isn't necessarily that those languages are any closer than Icelandic is to English. It's just that Icelandic has maintained so much of that medieval structure, um, different cases and such. Whereas Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish have lost the case system just like English, have very simple verb inflection just like English. Yeah, they're easy to learn.
Yeah.
I would say if you go back to the proverbial year zero, right, there's no difference between English, Scandinavian, Gothic, and German.
Yeah.
By the first few centuries AD, there is a difference between East Germanic, Gothic, North Germanic, and Scandinavia, and then West Germanic, which would become English, German, Dutch. Um, by the 600s, there are some differences detectable between a West Norse, Norwegian, and an East Norse, Swedish, and Danish group. But the Scandinavian languages have been in such close contact for so long that although there are splits, they re-influence each other. So there's a deeper split, for example, between Norwegian and Swedish. They're already splitting, you can see in around the 600s, minor differences. But now, even though Norwegian is closer in that sort of linguistic ancestry tree to Icelandic, it is easier for Norwegian to understand Swedish than to understand Icelandic because they've just been in touch. And they're structurally, they've lost a lot of that grammatical complexity that Icelandic has. So I would say the split between English and Scandinavian is happening in the first few centuries AD. It's probably precipitated. There's much more of a split precipitated when the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Frisians, whatever tribes are going to Britain. All of a sudden now they're no longer neighbors with North Germanic speakers, so that's going to accelerate a lot of the differences. But by the time the Vikings are raiding there in the 800s, 900s, it hasn't been that long, and so they haven't changed that much relative to one another, and they can still more or less learn each other's languages pretty easily. But in the last 1,000 years, it's not like there's been a lot of contact between these languages, so they've diverged quite a bit from each other. But still, gone down similar developmental paths so that the grammar of modern Norwegian is not, I would actually say it probably is even more similar to the grammar of modern English than English's technical closest relatives like Frisian and Dutch. They've just gone down very similar developmental paths. For example, the possessive in S
Yeah.
for every noun, right? That's a common innovation between Scandinavian and English that, uh, other Germanic languages have sometimes pretty different ways of expressing possession. Uh, but English and Scandinavian both agree that no, just S on everything. That makes it, just a tiny bit easier to learn the system.
Actually, that's an interesting that you say that because in my class that I teach on Viking Age history, in the module where we're doing sort of language and art and stuff, I have this little like I don't know 5 or 6 minute video clip that John McWhorter did about the linguistic thing, but he focuses on plurals. But he actually does start out by saying, hey, like 2,500 years ago or 2,000 years ago, whatever, like Old English and Old German were basically the same thing, and then they kind of start to sort of slowly move away from each other. But then he talks about like during the Viking Age, then coming this idea of, there was just, I guess, a more cumbersome way of formulating plurals with Old English and sort of having to remember, like, one goat is a goat, but a bunch of goats is a gat or gats or something like that, where it's like, no. And then the Norse come in. I mean, obviously, he's like, hyper simplifying everything, but then it's like, and then the Norse come in and basically it's like, yeah, no, that's too complex. Like, let's just put an S on the end of everything. And now it's sort of, cat, cats, house, houses, or whatever, kind of thing.
I don't I don't actually agree with the notion that the reason English simplified the system is because of Scandinavian contact. Because English dialects that aren't that closely in contact with Scandinavian make the same simplifications, and Scandinavian dialects that aren't that closely in contact with English make the same simplifications. Just both languages over time are reducing the complete, because in Proto-Indo-European, you have a variety of stem classes for nouns. That degenerates into a system in Proto-Germanic where you can make like plurals 15 different ways. So Old English and Old Norse inherit that, and it is complex.
Yeah.
And it's stable for a while. It's actually still fairly stable in modern Icelandic, but a lot of speakers just rebel against this. Like, why is this plural ear and this plural are and this plural as we change the root of the noun? People want to regularize that over time. The fact that both Scandinavians and English speakers do that, I don't think has anything to do with them being in contact with each other. It's just like a common impulse to just be like, nah, let's screw that. It's too complex.
Because he talks about, reading a book, or if you have two books, it's beak, and but then it's like, why is it a moose and not meese? It goes through that whole,
Yeah. But there used to be a system to this,
yeah.
and you can learn the system. It's just that, again, naturally, very often in languages all around the world, people want to simplify this stuff, right? They want to just say, well, like, say the plural of everything the same way. Yeah.
I think that simplification has to do with the contact. I mean, it just becomes, I mean, it's sort of standardization, right? Obviously becomes sort of not necessarily just easier, but almost required. The wider the net of the various types of people that you're going to come into contact with, that, you're all sort of playing by the same rules, as it were.
I just don't think that that's a common feature of language contact. People don't tend to change their language because other people are learning it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, English still has a fairly complex system here. Um, yeah, S plural for a lot of things, but it's still man, men, goose, geese, child, children. French has some complexities in the system too, and has been used as a lingua franca for a long time. Just a language being a lingua franca doesn't cause it to simplify. It's typically internal pressure rather than external pressure that causes this kind of thing.
Hmm.
I would say.
which
Uh,
is which is something that has been a focus of in France, because in the 1600s there was the Académie that was created to standardize the French language, because they wanted everybody, first of all, they wanted everybody in the realm to speak the same language, and then also is to stop the changes in the languages that were so prevalent, throughout the medieval period, where it just kept changing, right? So they're kind of trying to get a handle on it. That didn't happen in English, but I see what you mean. We can see in France an effort to stop that internal pressure to change the language.
And in Iceland, Iceland has in the last century been very puristic and with a lot of buy-in from the population. It's not, just handed down from the top and invented new words for just about everything, right? Like there is an Icelandic word for Tyrannosaurus Rex. There's an Icelandic word for DNA. There's an Icelandic word for, USB stick. Um, the last generation or two has been less puristic about this stuff, but yeah, you can see some languages the speakers want to consciously maintain uh, this older system or this continuity with the past for extra linguistic reasons, right? In Iceland, it's often like identification with that awesome literature. In France, it's this, you know, it's perhaps la gloire, right? I don't know. I'm not as in touch with French as I am with Icelandic. But in English, I don't think there's often been much of that attitude. English speakers, I think, have largely throughout the history of this language thought of it as nothing more than a means of communication and not thought about it very explicitly on its own very much. I do seem to remember John McWhorter having a lot of ideas about Norse and English that I didn't quite agree with. And runes, right? Doesn't he think runes are directly from Phoenician?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen him talk about that. Yeah. It's mostly was just the plurals thing and acknowledging that, it didn't change across the board because of like, and he uses exactly some of the examples you just did, child, children, tooth, teeth, these things that I think as he says it, sort of so ingrained that it was just, hard to get rid of it or whatever. But the rest
Well,
was
and it is definitely true that the more common a word is, the more likely you are going to maintain weird things about it,
yeah,
right? Like you can remember man, men because you say that every day. But if
yeah,
there's a plural for, I don't know, thermometer, you're not going to remember that because
yeah.
you're just not going to say it every day, right? Actually, a good example of that is octopus. Hypothetically, the plural is octopodes.
Octopi.
Nobody remembers that because they don't say octopus every day. Yeah. So sort
Yeah,
of
I
same.
know I was talking with the same subscriber about we were agreeing about the naming commission in Iceland and the I mean like just what you said, sort of this interest to maintain some kind of connection to the past and it's beyond linguistic. And I think it also has to do, at least somewhat, at least if my Icelandic friends are telling the truth, that the use of the alphabet to so that the names are still kind of using that alphabet as well. But also, I remember one of my friends telling me a bit about when new things come around, sort of like cell phones being invented or computers or things like that, that the words that they use for these things are very much connected to like old school words that sometimes get sort of put together in a way that makes sense to them but doesn't immediately sort of it's not immediately apparent to somebody who's not an Icelandic speaker as to why they would use that word, right, for like computer or something.
Yeah, like sime,
Yeah,
phone is an old word for cord.
yeah,
Computer is tolva, which is a
yep.
combination of telea, a count, and vulva, a witch.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know this guy on the that sent me that article that I shared with you too. Like it's well written, but it's not anything that's really new. But he's just
Mhm.
very adamant about. You could tell he's like, maybe a bit invested in the idea of, what he senses as the purity of what, it meant to be a Viking. And it's just somebody who happens to be from a bay. And it's not a pirate and it's not a job. And there's not necessarily actually violence implied. And I'm like, yeah, ask the people who are the victims whether or not they're going to connect those two things.
Hmm.
So it's kind
What?
of like, well, agree to disagree kind of thing.
Why do people obsess about this so much?
I
Yeah.
don't know. We have talked about that a lot on this podcast. It's like,
Yeah.
what is going on here?
I
Yeah.
I think part of it must be that people construct so much of their identity from movies and such, and they get this notion that, movie Vikings, which we were calling Vikings, like that's me. So I have to have this word has to mean something that is favorable to me. It's like you can't make that true of people speaking a language 1200 years ago. I'm more interested in what they meant, right? I don't feel like it has any implications for me because like they didn't know I was here. Right. or was going to be here. So like, I just want to know what they meant. Um, but if you want to understand Vikings, understanding the word Viking doesn't actually do that much for you because they don't use it that much. Um,
Yeah, yeah. And that actually reminds me of stuff that I've written and talked about with regard to the BJ 581 burqa, woman warrior grave or whatever. And it's not necessarily anything to do with like, is she or isn't she kind of thing. It's more like, why do you care? Like, why do you need her to have been this
yeah,
thing?
yeah.
And then I even said something like, I would venture a guess that women who lived 1200 years ago didn't spend a hell of a lot of time thinking about what we would think about them. It's like,
No, no, and I mean, and that's a fascinating burial. I've been there myself this last summer. Just incredible. Um, and you can have a discussion about what's there without it reflecting who you are. Um, I mean, I'm personally pretty persuaded that this woman was, engaging in some martial pursuits, right? That's fascinating. That doesn't mean that was common. It doesn't mean anybody living today is one thing or another thing because of what this woman was
exactly.
doing 1200 years ago. Like I don't
Yep.
know. I feel like history has to be studied for its own sake and not for what it says about what we should or shouldn't do or be today. But
100%.
there's such a drive to justify present day labels and categories by
Yeah.
appeal to something older. And I don't know. I just don't. I I don't think that that's often very useful. Um, I mean, for example, you can argue that I don't know. Sometimes people do this with linguistics. They say, well, uh, you should say who and whom in these different contexts because that's how people used to talk. It's like, okay, well, then you should use nominative, accusative, genitive, dative, vocative, instrumental, allative, and locative cases for every noun that you use because that's how people used to speak your language too. Like, or do you stop, right? If you're just trying to justify things by how old they are, like you can kind of infinitely go back
Yeah.
and perhaps finally argue that we should be single-celled creatures in the sea. And, like
Yeah.
like, where does this stop?
Non-gendered.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess because then we're just reproducing by splitting. Like what is that called? Parthenogenesis. Yeah.
Yep.
So
Well, it's that very human tendency to seek outside validation for an unexamined internal condition.
yeah, yeah,
Yes.
And
That's a good way to put it.
that's where
That's
that's where it comes from. And so, and sometimes studying history can help open the door to look into that internal condition and say, this is interesting. Why do I feel this way? And then you can kind of, who knows, not my
well,
business.
it's like anything. It's I think very often these things are on one of those curves where you learn a little bit and you feel really, really confident that you know everything about it, and then you learn more, and all of a sudden you realize like, oh, I
I
will
don't know
never learn enough,
anything.
and
Hmm.
your confidence sort of goes back down again.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I heard a
yeah,
good one about that too. Knowledge is like an inflating balloon, and at the beginning, the distance between this part and this part is very short, and then the more knowledge you get, the more it inflates, and the farther you are from where you started.
yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah, I thought that was really good. I was like, oh yeah, I feel that on a daily basis. I feel really
Or
stupid these days.
or Alexander Pope, with
Yeah.
a little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Pierian spring. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I try to drink deep and only usually comment on things where I've drunk pretty deep. Um, but it's yeah, I mean, my motivation with learning anything about this stuff, of course, has never had to do with identity. I don't claim to be a Viking. I'm not even Scandinavian by descent, right? Um, but I know for a lot of people that can be a motivation, and like it's fine to start that way, but I think that you have to realize this stuff is never going to tell you how to live or,
Right. Oh,
validate.
people think it is though, right? They like are gonna go like, I'm gonna read Havamal and it's gonna tell me how to be a good person, right?
It
It's got good
can.
advice in there.
I
Yeah.
Yeah,
mean,
actually, like I don't think Albemarle is bad at all to follow, but nobody does.
Oh, what's that one stanza? It's wake early if you want another man's life. Okay, so that validates my envy.
Yeah,
Hmm.
there you go. Well, I mean, that's also one stanza that is pretty different in tone than most of it.
Yeah.
Um, but people mostly don't want to approach a text like that anyway as an empty vessel, right? People don't typically approach Havamal or any other text of ethical precepts that might be the Gospels, that might be something by Confucius, and say, I am empty of preconceptions. I want to take what this tells me and I'm going to follow that. They typically start with preconceptions. How is this going to justify my preconceptions? Half the time that I see Havamal quoted online, it's not Havamal, it's something somebody made up.
Hmm.
Which is extra funny because it takes about 40 minutes to read Havamal. It's not actually that long.
Yeah, well, that just gets to the thing that, I've said for so long and written about, and especially with, again, when we talk about history or historical periods like the Viking Age, where you've got issues or gaps and silences in the evidence that people just like just pour themselves right in and just make it be what they want it to be. And that's a very old human thing as well. It's not, it's not exclusive to this, interest in the Viking Age. It's
No.
that people look back at the past and sort of create the narrative that suits them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned genetics earlier, and one of the things that I've admired about the lab at Harvard that's made so many of the breakthroughs in paleogenetics in the last 15, 20 years is they don't work on their own ancestry, right? The grad students work on a group that they are not a member of.
Mm,
And I think that that's admirable, right? Like this is not people seeking to brag about their own past. It's trying to tell a story of humanity, and that's really what I kind of want to do myself, although I focus on one particular area.
yeah. Actually, that brings to mind something that I did want to ask you about because I've done a similar thing. And this doesn't have anything to do with the Viking Age or, Norse or anything necessarily, but just the landscape of what it means to engage in this kind of work now, and especially I'm a historian, an archaeologist or whatever, and CJ is as well. And so the idea of looking into the past and kind of trying to learn and teach about it and stuff. I mean, and it typically tended to be the pursuit of somebody who's part of the academy, and yet, so I was a tenured faculty, and then 3 years ago I decided I just didn't want to do that anymore, and for various reasons, and a lot of it had to do with the administrative stuff, so I just stepped back so I could adjunct and focus on my class and students, which for me is the fun and the interesting part. But just the whole higher ed game, I mean, and you've like turned away from it and now are focusing just on your YouTube channel and other things that you do and public speaking and such. And so it's like, can you just speak to a little bit of like kind of that choice? And then, people who are sort of getting their freshly minted PhDs, hoping to get into the academy and everything. And it's such a different landscape than it used to be. And there's not as many jobs. And so people are like sort of by definition being forced to kind of come up with, I think, more creative ways to engage with these things and then get it out there into the world. So how have you found that whole transition to be?
Well, my engagement in this pursuit is pretty accidental, right? I didn't set out to be a YouTuber as an occupation, right? Um, it's just something that I wound up doing to try to make a little bit of extra money early on. And actually, before I was trying to use it to make a little bit of extra money, I was just trying to use it as like kind of a public service, right? Just putting information out there where people were looking for it. It's pure chance that I wound up being able to um, reach enough people that I've been able to support myself with Patreon, which has been my main source of income for 6 or 7 years now, which is pretty incredible to think about. Um, I've always been cherry about what I tell people about going into academia because the thing is, like, I obviously understand the intellectual curiosity that makes you want to do that, but it's like just you're just rolling dice as far as jobs. I don't know if it's even that there's fewer jobs. There probably are, but part of it is just there's such a huge pool of people competing for them. And
Yeah.
I think often grad students too don't understand that I am very curious about this. I love studying it is not what gets you hired, right? So a lot of grad students come in and they're great students, but they're not necessarily great researchers, right? And they don't realize that that's like it is not cut it. It's like I love Old English. I like reading Beowulf. It's like that's great. That's awesome. I never want to discourage that. But you realize that no one's going to hire you because of that. They're going to hire you because you have something to say about it, right? And then even then you're competing against way more people than you realize for whatever position. Um, and then increasingly those jobs aren't tenure track. But then, like I think I kind of got into this at a little bit of a sweet spot um, before, because I feel like this is probably not exactly true, but I feel like I was part of maybe not the first, you know, the very, very first people trying to talk about this kind of stuff on the internet, but I feel like I was part of a pretty early wave that now is so saturated that there's a lot of competition here too, right? Because somebody says like, okay, I'm going to make like let's not even use Old Norse as an example, but like let's just take something even more niche, maybe like I'm going to be trying to think of something I don't know somebody's doing. I don't know. I'm going to be the old high German YouTube guy. Okay, cool. There's more interest in that than you would think. That channel would get subscribers, but you have to put out so much material for people to even realize you're there. And then, like, what exactly are you monetizing about it, right? Are you saying, like, hey, support me on Patreon and I'll keep putting this stuff out? Okay, that's great. Can you get enough people to do that? Like, I feel like I was in this just early enough that people were like, oh, this is different and new, and I want to support this. Now, enough people have this idea that like I think it's getting about as hard to break into as classic academia. So it's not like I even would recommend like go and try to start a YouTube channel or go and try to start a podcast right now because there is a lot of competition.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know. It's too bad that these things have to be jobs, right?
Yeah.
That you have to think about like, well, how can I monetize this? Because ideally, you would just be intellectually curious about it and be able to fulfill that curiosity and not have to feel the hassle. But because it takes so much of your time to get good at anything like this, you do want to make a job out of it. I mean, certainly I would, it's in the time since I got my PhD that I've had to work at something else, there's been that gnawing feeling of like, man, why did I get a freaking PhD? Right. I'm like, and in my but between when I was working at UCLA and working at UC Berkeley, I was mopping up vomit in a little museum bathroom, right? And thinking like, why on earth did I get a PhD, right? Like I'm gonna like. So I feel for people. It's hard. It can be real hard to justify, and it's not just that academia is hard to get a job. It's hard to get a job in the alternative sources too. Um, and I don't count on this to last forever either,
Yeah.
right? Eventually, YouTube disappears, or um, people just lose interest or someone else, draws all the uh, views away from me towards something, it can, who knows what will end it, but it's not going to last my entire life.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
And
It's I remember when I was applying for a PhD back in 2009, just before, or just right in the thick of the Great Recession. And I had a friend of mine who was in actually the political science department who was telling me like, don't do it. Don't go for the PhD. They're just gonna. By that time, the university that I was at was basically he's like, they bring on X number of PhD candidates and then they only pass very few, but then they're going to drown you in work for 7 years and use you for cheap labor to teach, low level sections. And
yeah,
he said that's the environment here. And I didn't listen to him, so I still applied. I got in, And then I got the letter that said, "Oh, sorry, we're cutting the humanities department by 40% this year because of budget shortfall, and the football team needs money." And I was just like, I hate football. And then
Yeah.
that's why I don't watch football. But then at the end, as all of that was happening, I was talking to my parents. They're like, maybe that's not the best, course to take for your life. It doesn't sound like it's going to be a lucrative career to try and go get a PhD in history and that sort of thing. And then at the time, I was working at Radio Shack. And we had a new hire like that day that I got the letter, right? And then so I was kind of bummed about not having the PhD program. I was like, what am I going to do next? And then we got this new hire, she was older than me, but now it's been so long. I see her as a young woman who she's talking about how she'd just gotten her PhD and there's no jobs. And I was like, wait, so yeah, she's like, yeah, I just spent the last 7 years getting a PhD and now I'm working at Radio Shack. And I was like, well, then why the heck am I going to go get a PhD if I'm just going to end up working at Radio Shack anyway?
Yeah. 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 I mean, and part of this is, well, weirdly, this even ties back to what we were saying at the very beginning about, uh, investing your identity in what you do. Um, we do a lot of this, and like you cannot help it. If you get a PhD, part of your identity is kind of in that because you spent years and years and years deep diving on this topic. And there's greater and lesser degrees of this, but to a certain degree, it becomes your possession to you, right? Like this is my thing. And it's like, man, why can't I make money off of my thing? Right? It's like and you feel sort of defeated going back and doing something else. Like this is unfortunately part of why PhDs wind up in parents' basements and stuff. It's just like they don't want to go and do something else. I didn't have that option. I had to go and do something else between, my job at UCLA ceasing to exist and then getting hired at Berkeley a year later. Um, it's a struggle. And I do part of course, what I want to do with the YouTube channel is allow people access to information that is hard to get outside of this grad programs. Um, you know, like, can I satisfy your curiosity without you feeling like you have to make a job out of this? Um, and will you be thankful enough for that that you'll maybe donate $5 a month on Patreon, right? Like that's kind of my bargain is like, give me, let's say $60 a year instead of giving somebody else $60,000 a year. And I'll give you access to the same information and maybe you won't feel like you have to go get a job, but maybe you'll also, I always kind of hope apply some of the same tools to other fields, right? Like I always kind of hope that I'm teaching a certain amount of responsibility with source information, a certain amount of skepticism. Um, you know, I it's probably thinking too grandiosely, but I always sort of hope that I'm also giving people that toolkit in addition to specific information about this field.
Yeah. Yeah, I know you are with my students for sure, because they'll do a little, research project and then they'll come up with, some of your videos or I will send them some of the videos and it's just like
Oh, gosh.
I allow people to use, YouTube videos as a source very sparingly. It has to be somebody who's a scholar, knows what they're talking about, who's behind it. And
Well,
so
I'd rather they use YouTube videos than like ask ChatGPT.
yeah, well, that's pretty new, actually. I've only just in the last maybe 6 8 months or something, have started to see that. I know other faculty who've were sort of pearl clutching about it earlier than that. But that was another thing of okay, this game, this job. Like, I don't want this job to just become about being whack-a-mole in this thing that you are not going to win this game. So, I've got people like sitting in meetings talking about how they're going to tweak their syllabus to make it so that students will use ChatGPT. And it's kind of like, I don't know. I don't want this job to boil down to that. That's not why I'm here.
It can become whack-a-mole. I mean, I do these classes on Zoom now, just under my own aegis. Um, but I, I don't encounter a whole lot of people trying to resort to that kind of thing, mostly because I'm not grading them,
Yeah.
right? Nothing rides on it. Like if you're going to learn Old Norse because you want to, that's why you're paying me and not going to college, like this isn't about a grade because I have no grade to give you.
Yeah.
Like all I'm going to say is like, yeah, can you read this? Great. Can you not read this? Let's work on this some more.
Yeah.
But so as long as the motivation is purely just I want to learn, there's not very much of that. That's mostly because people want to get the credential without going through the process of the credential, right? Like
Yeah.
I want the credit for this class. I don't really care about learning it. Not much of that with, again, Zoom classes under my own aegis.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's what we do at Peter and I run medievalist.net, and that's what we've got. We started a thing with online classes. Same thing, and CJ teaches for us too. You could come teach for us, teach Old Norse, but you've got your own thing. But yeah, it's the same deal. It's like, nobody's giving you a quiz or an assignment, It's sort
Yeah.
of like we're all just here because we're interested in this stuff.
Which is great, right?
Yeah.
Like if I could have the best of both worlds, if I could
Yeah.
have institutional support for that,
Yeah.
like, you know, welcome to the University of I don't know, trying to just make something up, welcome to the University of Northeastern Colorado, where um, we are not going to grade you and we're not going to give you a piece of paper. You're just going to spend some time here learning whatever you want to learn about, and then you're going to go back into the world and decide how you're going to make money, and that's going to be a separate question.
Yeah.
Man, that would be fun, right?
Right? Yeah.
Like to actually just have people who could just live as students for a few years and just sort of develop their understanding of the world and not have to worry about the grades per se. Like some universities experiment with stuff like that. Like I think St. John's kind of does something similar to that. But yeah, that'd be great. It would also be fun to actually have students in a classroom again, right? I don't think Zoom is the ultimate way of doing this. It's the only way for me to get enough students, but like I'd much rather interact with people in person. I get that to a
Yeah.
certain degree from public speaking stuff, but I do miss the classroom probably more than anything else.
So then what's next for you as far as are you working on any translations or
Yeah, the next books that I'm contracted to bring out are this Old Norse textbook based on the materials that I've been teaching Old Norse with for a long time. That may actually be, it sounds like from recent communications with my publisher, that may actually be kind of in process of getting worked on. Supposedly, they might have sent it to peer reviewers recently, so that sounds good. Also, a prose edit translation. Um, so those are the books that are next on the horizon. Otherwise, I keep going with these Zoom classes and putting out YouTube videos. Um, some weeks I put out a lot of YouTube videos, and some weeks I put out a few. You know, like I said, I've stopped trying to predict what the algorithm wants, and I typically just put stuff out when I have stuff to put out. It still
yeah.
surprises me how much that winds up being.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, circling back to Dan Carlin, I mean, it's the same.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unbelievable to me. Like he spends so much time just behind the scenes and like literally, like I said, puts out, one podcast a year these days and then goes on and it has started in the last year or two doing like these public speaking events where he goes out on like a little tour, and
Yeah.
stops in a few cities and stuff. But like the adoring crowds that continue to show up for this guy, even though he's just kind of drip, drip, drip out there. It's just kind of insane, actually.
That's a sweet spot to be in.
Holy
Yeah.
cow. Well, and also probably the benefit of like you're talking about being an early adopter. I mean, he started his podcast in 2005.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like he has famous stories about, going around to these various platforms and pitching what they wanted to do. Like nobody even knew what the hell a podcast was, kind of thing. And people are like, no. And it was even before YouTube. And he's like, we envision that there'll be this time when, and people are like, no, that'll never happen. People uploading their own videos, that's ridiculous,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's amazing, like just in our own lifetimes, what's gone from being like, please, to just
Yeah.
to actually being old hat, right? Like, I mean, nowadays, like I'm going to start a history podcast, like, oh, okay, like like, but of course, when he was doing it, no one, it's like, what, a radio show basically that you just do on the internet? Like, come on,
Yeah.
who's going to
Yeah.
listen to this?
Yep. Turns out
And
everybody.
and then
Yeah.
and then Joe Rogan made one, and he changed the world.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, and that was like
people,
2009 when he started.
Yeah.
That's really early also.
Mhm.
yeah,
So,
and people don't realize how big audiences can be, even for very niche subjects.
yeah.
I mean, you know, I I still, most of my public speaking events anywhere, whether it be, a few hundred seats or a few dozen seats, they sell out,
Yeah.
but no one ever expects them to, right? People are like Viking, like Norse language, mythology, whatever. Like no one's interested in this. No one realizes, unless you're into it, you don't realize how many people are into it.
Yeah.
So I can only imagine how many people you reach with something as wide ranging as he does.
Yeah. So,
Well, I have to go before too long
yeah.
here, folks. But
I have one last question because you've got a, oh, I forget the name. Was it something rather? It's the device in theater for the, you put a gun on a table, you have to use the gun.
Chekhov's
In
gun.
There we go. Check out his gun. Thank you. I'm so severely sleep deprived right now from jet lag. But you have Chekhov's backpack on your background. What's in the bag?
Um,
It's a
He's like, I don't
backpack.
know.
I thought
Yeah, it's just sitting there. I'm like, is there something in it that's like important?
what?
so these are my mics. So I
Ah,
film all my videos with my phone. So you connect this one to the phone and you put this one on your shirt. Um, Works pretty well until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, I get lots of complaints about uh, volume. Here's the little windbreak that I always need because it's super windy here. There's chapstick and a lighter. There's cigars in case I run into a friend who wants to smoke a cigar. There's notes for videos, and
there you
there's
ha
an anti-stalker device, and I'll leave it at that.
well, there you have it, ladies and
Oh,
gentlemen. You got to see intimately inside Dr. Jackson Crawford's bag on
Right.
only on Vikingology.
oh,
Ooh,
thanks to CJ's nosiness. Wow,
and
gosh.
and sweet patches, right? I've got my
Oh,
little
nice.
raven with the cowboy hat and the Colorado flag.
Oh, nice.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and that comes from that that backpack is from Varustelega, which is like the Finnish Cabela's. So this is
Yeah.
Finnish camo, which is perfect for Colorado too.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
yeah.
There we go. It's been my experience that whatever you have in your background is something that you want to talk about. That's why I asked about the bag, right? It's like I had a friend who
No,
saw in
we're
my background, oh, whatever books you have face out
Yeah.
is generally books you wrote. I was like, that's
that is true of a lot of people. It's actually not necessarily true of me. We're in fact moving. God, I hate the constant moving, but it's part of life. Um, so in fact, this place is very nearly bare right now, and this is one of the few surfaces above floor level that I can put something on right now.
ah.
So that's actually all it is. Because I was hoping to film later.
All right. Well, I
Well, thank
appreciate you giving us a tour of the bag. Thanks for coming
yeah.
on the show.
Hey,
Yeah,
I
really
appreciate you folks.
really enjoyed it. Yeah.